The purpose of this brief video is to give you an overview of the life of William Shakespeare, both the known and the unknown. The fact is, we know less about Shakespeare than we wish we did. We know that he was baptized on April the 26th, 1564, in Stratford-upon-Avon. It's believed that he was born 3 days before that, so his birthday is traditionally celebrated on April the 23rd, but we have no factual basis for that. In fact, it is because he also died on April the 23rd that many people think the romance of that date is so important, and that's the date we traditionally ascribe to his birth. We know that he was the son of the alderman, later the High Bailiff, which is the equivalent of a modern mayor, a man named John Shakespeare, who was a glover by profession, a man who made gloves, and his mother's name was Mary. She was the daughter of an affluent local landowner. We don't know anything specific about his youth, nor about any any other boy living at the time that he lived in Stratford-upon-Avon. All the records are lost, but there's no reason to believe anything other than that he was educated at the King's School in Stratford, where he would have been highly educated in Latin grammar and Latin classics, probably even putting on some plays by Plautus and Terence to learn the models and learn Latin grammar. Surprisingly, he would have had almost no education in English composition or English grammar, as those were not subjects taught in school yet. When he was 18 years old, he got married to a woman named Anne Hathaway, who, according to the only source we have, and it's somewhat ambiguous, seems to have been several years older than he was, 7 years older than he was. The marriage was a very hurried affair. It involved a lot of complications, getting special licenses from the church to be held during the period of Lent. But it was clearer why it was such a hurried affair when 6 months later his daughter Susanna was born. Obviously, Anne was pregnant already, and there was some rush to get them married. 2 years after that, Anne gave birth to a set of twins, Hamnet and Judith. That was in 1585. And then, after his twins were born, he disappears completely from the historical record, and when he reappears again in 1592, he is already living and working in London. We have a period known, therefore, 7 years, as the 7 lost years. There's a lot of speculation that during that time period he might have been a schoolmaster, he might have toured the continent a little bit, he might have become an actor fairly early, because by the time we know of him in London in 1592, he already seems well established in the theater. It's perfectly possible that shortly after 1585, he moved to London and started a career and work in the theater. When we do see him again, it's because a rival playwright named Robert Greene attacks him in print by paraphrasing one of his plays and suggesting that he was an upstart crow, that is, that he was too big for his britches, stealing the thunder of better educated and more prominent playwrights. But this attack reveals to us more than anything else that he was an actor and already making his mark as a writer as well. Just 2 years after that, we have documents that associate him with the Lord Chamberlain's Men, a company that was under the patronage of the Queen's Chief of Staff. Lord Chamberlain was the official title in that time. And that company was the company that he stayed with for the rest of his working life. it was later taken under the wing of the king, King James I, and they became the King's Men, but it was the same group. It was only the name of the group that was changing. Several of Shakespeare's early plays went into print, but as was quite common in this period, he was not actually given credit on the title page. A lot of plays were printed without any authorship credit whatsoever. But in 1598, his name appears on a printed play for the first time, telling us that by that point, he was famous enough that his name was a selling point. In 1616, Ben Jonson published his complete works and lists the names of the actors who performed in his plays, and that list of actors lists Shakespeare in two plays, one dating to 1598 and one 1603. So we know that during this time period he was not only a playwright but also a working actor in the company. Shakespeare became surprisingly wealthy early in his life, becoming a co-owner of his theater company made him a very wealthy man, the equivalent of a modern millionaire. And by 1597, he had enough money to purchase the second largest house in his old hometown. He paid a great deal of money for it. By 1605, he made a number of quite substantial investments in parish tithes, which was a kind of financial stock market of the time. And in 1613, he bought some London property at Blackfriars Priory, which was a very substantial apartment in a very tony district of London near his company's private theatre. His life in London is not well documented, but we have a few glimpses of him. In 1596, we know that he is living apart from his family in London in an area, in a northern district called Bishopsgate. And in that same year, we know that his son Hamnet, who was living in Stratford, died of unknown causes. Like so many things that we wish we had more details about, we don't know what Shakespeare's feeling about that was. We don't know how he found out that Hamnet died. We don't know if he made it back for the funeral. We don't know if he was close to his son and it was devastating, or if he was very distant from his son and barely knew him. All of those seem distinct possibilities. By 1599, we know that he has moved to a different section of the city, Southwark, near the Globe Theatre. And in 1604, we know that he's renting apartments from Christopher Mountjoy near St. Paul's Cathedral. The reason we know that is that in 1612, he was called as a witness in a legal case concerning Mountjoy's daughter, and his place of residence is listed in that legal case. Shakespeare probably retired in 1613 when the first Globe Theatre burned down. He was still a young man, but he was wealthy enough to retire. But he might have retired even earlier than that. But certainly by 1614, he was already living back in Stratford. He prepared his will in 1614. And then shortly before his death in 1616, he revised that will, largely out of concern for his youngest daughter, who was marrying a fairly disreputable man. And Shakespeare was making sure in his will that his daughter inherited his property outright and the husband couldn't steal it out from under her. He died on April 23rd, 1616. You'll remember that a lot of people think he was born on April the 23rd, so he would have been exactly 52 years old when he died, still quite a young man. Even for this time period, he died surprisingly early. And he was buried 2 days later in the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, where his grave still stands. His will leaves most of his estate to his eldest daughter, Susanna. His son, Hamnet, had died many years earlier, and his
second daughter, Judith, was not as reliable and didn't marry as well, but Susanna married a very prominent physician, John Hall, and she got most of the estate. And notoriously, Shakespeare left his wife very few things, mostly including his, quote, second best bed, unquote. This is another one of those things we just wish we knew more about. Some scholars claim that the second best bed was the actual bed that they would have slept in themselves and that they would have saved the best bed for guests. But a lot of other scholars say, well, that's just sort of nonsense and we don't know, and maybe this is an indication that he and his wife were somewhat estranged and he was trying to kind of put her down in his will. But we really just don't have enough context to interpret the meaning of this comment. In 1623, a monument was installed in the church to commemorate him, and the monument also still stands there in Stratford. And later in that very same year, the thing that we think of as the real monument to Shakespeare, publication of his plays by two of his fellow playwrights, Hemmings and Condell, who collected all of his work and published it for posterity. Given those few things that we do know, there's a handful of things that we don't know and that we really wish we did. We have no manuscripts in Shakespeare's hand, with the possible exception of a brief passage from a play called Sir Thomas More. A couple of speeches have been identified in it as being sounding Shakespearean and written in a handwriting that appears to be similar to that in the 7 known signatures of Shakespeare from real life. But we have so few examples of his handwriting, it's very hard to tell. We have no extant correspondence from Shakespeare. We do have 2 letters written to him, but those were saved in the papers of the person who was going to send them and apparently never did, or they wouldn't still be in his papers, right? We have no books or records of his library. We have no notes. We have no diaries. We have no papers reflecting on his state of mind. All we have is the plays and some legal records about purchases, quarrels that he was in during his life, quarrels that he was a party to or a witness to. The most autobiographical things we think we have are the sonnets, which seem to be an incredibly personal account of a period of his life. But no one knows if they constitute autobiography or if they're actually just pure fiction. Many of his plays seem equally close and autobiographical, but those are obviously invented characters, and it's perfectly possible that the sonnets tell a story of an invented character too, and not his personal life story. I'm not among those who think that. I actually think the sonnets probably do reflect his personal life story, but I have no hard evidence for that. It's more my feeling from reading them than anything else. There are 4 great controversies about Shakespeare. The first is that during his time, when it was required that people be a Protestant, but there were a number of people who were still hearkening back to the old religion of Catholicism, it looks like it was possible that Shakespeare was himself a recusant Catholic. His father almost certainly was a recusant Catholic, and to the degree that Shakespeare may have harbored any religious feelings, it's possible that deep in his heart he remained loyal to the Catholic Church. This, of course, is a very controversial claim. During his life, such an accusation that he was actually Catholic would have put him in a very difficult position. Could have been career destroying, something he could not have said openly and didn't say, so we just don't know. The sonnets portray a narrator who is unambiguously bisexual, attracted to both a mistress, the dark lady of the sonnets, and a young man to whom most of them are addressed. But we don't know if that's autobiographical. Even if the character is fictional, the emotional intensity of the relationship to the young man would suggest that Shakespeare was um, at least open to the idea of same-sex attractions. Uh, and it seems perfectly possible that he was bisexual, but it also is very difficult to read that across time, even when there were not such rigid categories or conceptions of sexuality in the Renaissance era. And so again, we have a controversy that is almost impossible to resolve. There's no certain portraiture of Shakespeare, so we don't know exactly how he looked. There are several possible candidates, most of whom have been featured in this slideshow as it has gone along, but none of them are absolutely and certainly accepted as being Shakespeare. And though I've not shown you a lot of these pictures, there are also a number of other pictures that were claimed over a large period of time as being portraits of Shakespeare that we now know are fakes. Finally, there's something called the authorship controversy, an odd set of speculations that started in the 18th century with a woman named Delia Bacon, but continue strongly into our time with people who believe that there was an actor named Shakespeare, but that he was basically an illiterate from the country, and that the plays were really written by all sorts of candidates, about nearing 100 now, candidates for the person who, quote, really wrote the plays, unquote. But the most prominent candidate is the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. But Sir Francis Bacon has also been credited with plays, and as I say, quite a number of other Elizabethan figures, including Queen Elizabeth, have been suggested at one point or another as the actual authors of the play. I find most of this controversy entirely manufactured by kind of feverish minds and not based on what we would think of as literary evidence or any evidence of the time. In fact, I find it somewhat ridiculous. But I want to acknowledge at least that it exists, and that students who know very little else about Shakespeare may know something about the authorship controversy. That at least will give you a brief overview of Shakespeare's biography insofar as we know it. We don't know anything like as much as we would like to know. We know far more about the literature than we know about his personal life, but the amount we know about his personal life is not uncommon for figures of his age. This was before the age of biography, and people didn't collect biographical details in any particular depth. They didn't find them particularly interesting yet. So we know about as much about Shakespeare as we know most of the figures from his time, maybe a little more than we know about many other playwrights from the period, but there's absolutely no doubt that it is much, much less than we wish we know about the greatest playwright of all time.